My guest on this podcast is Paul Shamplina, most famously known for the Channel 5 series Tenant Slum Landlords. He's been a massive inspiration and a friend to landlords in trying to help and understand and protecting your interests. Right now, we've got enormous change coming with the Renters' Rights Bill. We focus on the things that you need to be aware of and how you need to protect yourself. So let's jump straight into the podcast.
So 24 years, I've been doing public speaking, TV and radio and stuff like that. When you run your own business, you become obsessed.
Yes.
Sometimes to your detriment, believe me, because you can't see the wood from the trees. But I've had this fire in my belly to succeed.
Hey Paul, I'm really thrilled to have you here today. You're the founder of Landlord Action, the commercial director of Hamilton Fraser, which covers the PRS, My Deposits. You've got Client Money Protect as well. And of course, the infamous Channel 5 TV program, which is Tenant Slum Landlords. And we haven't been here very long. We were chatting beforehand. There was already two people in the street stopping you for selfies as well. So you're already very well known. And, I'm really pleased that we're having this conversation today, because there's some huge threats facing landlords at the moment, especially with the Renters' Rights Bill. What do you see as the biggest challenges facing landlords? Because you've always been seen as the landlord's friend.
So look, being a landlord is not easy in 2025, Sarge. I've been in this industry. I've been helping landlords for 34 years. Landlords are used to regulation changes. They're used to it. And landlords are adaptable and flexible. Yeah. But the Renters' Rights Bill was the Renters' Reform Bill, which didn't get through the Conservatives, through the snap election. Now there's been a whole lot of other stuff that was added on top. The Renters' Rights Bill is a real concern for landlords. Landlords want confidence the system will work. Yeah. And of course, there is this anti-landlord feeling that landlords feel downtrodden. So it's about getting systems and processes in place. Mm-hmm. The big headline, which was part of the Labour agenda, obviously in their manifesto when being voted in, was the abolishment of non-fault Section 21 notices, 2-month notices. It's called non-fault, but there's normally always a reason. Yes. Let's be clear about that.
Because a landlord is not going to evict a good tenant for no reason.
Exactly. Landlords evict tenants at a last resort. Yeah. So the reality is the word non-fault actually came from a TV program where I was interviewed on Panorama. Okay. It was actually at my office. I was on for 17 seconds. Right. It was quite a tenant-centric piece where I said there's always a reason. The main reasons historically is rent arrears, where landlords won't claim the rent arrears back. They just want their property back. Yeah. Landlords are selling, which is at an all-time high now. We can talk about that in a second. Antisocial behaviour. They need to move back in the property. Or, and dare I say it, councils do it across the land. Stay put, wait till you're evicted so the council will rehouse you until eviction, which is a killer. And I've campaigned and I do lots of campaigning and stuff like that. That's the big headline, which means Section 21 goes. Fixed term tenancies are going as well, Sarge, as you know.
That means no minimum 6 months.
No minimum 6 months, 12 months, 24 months. They're going to be 1 month periodic tenancies.
So as soon as a tenant moves in, effectively they're on a 1 month tenancy.
Correct. And it's rolling over periodic. But you can't give a 2-month notice to say I want the property back. A tenant can give you 2 months notice after moving in for a month. Yes. Think about you run a letting agents and you're a landlord. Yeah. Think about the cost that a landlord goes through qualifying.
There's a huge upfront cost.
Of course.
And you generally spread that. You assume tenants can be there a year. You're spreading the costs. But now we're not really able to.
Well, you are. I mean, you've got to find the tenant. You've got to qualify them. You've got to reference them. And as an agent, obviously you had the tenant's fee ban as well. So a tenant, look, the whole point of why the Renters' Rights Bill, Renters' Reform Bill was coming in was to level up the playing fields, was to give tenants stronger rights to live in safer properties. They say the private rental sector, according to the English Housing Survey, stands at 21% of unsatisfactory properties. Okay. But we know that the private rental sector is better than the social housing sector. But for some reason, it's under the microscope a lot more than the private rental sector and the way landlords are perceived. The word landlord is perceived as a dirty word. It shouldn't be. Landlords are housing providers. Yeah. So we have to change within ourselves the stigma of being a landlord and how we portray ourselves as well. And that comes from and that comes from, joining a professional organisation like the National Residential Landlord Association. So they're the two headliners. How does that work? How do we get past that? And then, of course, if you want your property back, Sarge, in the new world, and we think that it might come in by the end of the year, if not maybe April next year. Yeah. At the moment, it's going through the House of Lords committee stage and it's going to go back up to the House of Parliament, which is majority Labour-led. So a lot of the amendments will be knocked back. Yeah. Then, of course, it needs royal assent, and there needs to be a transitional period. You can't just bring it in a big bang because the market will collapse. Then you have to have the grounds. So the grounds are Section 8 grounds. So as you know...
So this is the grounds under what grounds you're evicting somebody.
Correct. So they think there's going to be 30 to 33 grounds in total.
That many?
That many. A lot of them, I think, are quite weak and quite, irrelevant, if I'm being really honest.
Give us an example of a...
Well, I think one big change that's going to happen, Sarge, is at the moment a mandatory ground. So if the tenant's in 2 months' rent is a month and a day, under ground 8, you serve a 14-day notice.
Yes.
And then you go to court, the judge has to grant a possession order. They're moving that, and they've changed that under the Renters' Rights Bill to 3 months and 28 days. So if you don't do your credit control and get your communications right with your tenant or know that there's a problem, you serve a notice, then you have to apply to the court. You have to get a hearing date. You have to go before the judge. We do 30, 40 hearings a month at Landlord Action. We have advocates that represent landlords in England and Wales all over the country. Yeah. You'll get a possession order. And then, of course, once you get the possession order, then you've got to get the bailiffs in, which is my biggest concern, which I've done loads and loads of campaigning on. I can talk to you about that.
And if someone hasn't been through this process currently, this is not something that happens in 1 or 2 months. Currently, this could take months and months and months.
You can wait a year. We're waiting 15 months for an eviction date at Clerkenwell County Court. And if you ain't getting your rent, it's absolutely catastrophic. Yeah. Landlords aren't banks. I think what's happened recently, the last few years to landlords, their mortgage rates have shot right up, which has been a big reason why we're seeing at Landlord Action in the last year to 18 months, more landlords serving Section 21 notice than Section 8. Okay. But the courts are crumbling. There hasn't been any investment in the courts. We keep hearing there's going to be investment. They need 1,000 more judges. There's only 333 bailiffs.
So there's talk of a new court being set up just for this process?
Would I ask that question again?
So there's talk of a new court system being set up specifically for this?
Yeah, that was going to happen before COVID, called housing courts. And I went to Leeds and I went in the working group. I spoke to a judge there, and she said that then, this was in 2019 before COVID, she said that judges' morale were on all-time low then, right? They were fearing of their health and safety and their well-being in the courtroom. So the court buildings are crumbling. And of course, at the moment, they do Section 21 case where you don't need a hearing date. She said on average, it takes 15 minutes to look at a Section 21 case. Wow. Let me give you some stats. So last year in 2024, there was 29,000 Section 8 cases in the private rental sector. Okay. There was also 31,000 Section 21 cases. Right. I've predicted by the end of 2025, when the ban comes in, that will shoot right up. Use it before losing it. And we talked before on air. Yeah. What's going to happen now, the reality is landlords are going to look at their portfolios. There's landlords that most of the reason now landlords are serving Section 21 is because they're selling, because we asked them at Landlord Action. Yeah. So there is opportunity for other landlords to buy, albeit I think there'll be a lot more landlords buying other properties with tenants in situ, right? But I think also the reality is that the biggest loser in all this are tenants.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
You've got a good tenant. I've been your tenant for 8 years. You haven't put the rent up. Yeah. You care about your tenant, and that doesn't come out in the newspapers because bad landlord stories sell. And then what happens is, I'm sorry, but I have to sell. And I speak to tenants, I make myself available, and I still have done all these years, landlords, tenants, agents, giving them advice, so forth. Tenants have got more anxiety than ever before. They get a text from their landlord, they get worried. Are they going to serve notice on me?
So there's a huge uncertainty hanging over them as well. They don't know what's happening. Yeah,
of course. And they've got kids, they're in schools and whatever. And look at reality. It's calmed. The market's calmed down a bit now. Rents are stabilised. They were going through the roof.
Shot through the roof.
They shot through the roof.
When you were talking about increasing rents, we didn't increase any rents in a tenancy whilst a tenant was there. Doesn't matter how long they were there. We'd wait until they move out and then we'd review.
Well, that's really good practice.
But we've had to change that.
Cool show. And landlords
forced up with costs.
Landlords will put rents up before these regulations come in, because obviously what's also going to happen is the whole way you do rent increases and you go to first tier tribunal, and our tenants can reclaim and challenge that, and that's going to be more stringent. Tenants are going to have more rights. This is where landlords have to think mindset change. This really is a business. Whether I use an agent like yours or whether I self-manage, I still need to know what's going on. Yeah, I can't bury my head in the sand. Because if I bury my head in the sand,
wasn't never really seen as a business. It was kind of this side hustle investment thing. Yeah,
part-time landlord, amateur landlord. Those days are gone. Whether you've got 1 or 2 properties, if you don't like it, there's 2 or 3 options for you.
You've heard the phrase, your network is your net worth, and you'll also hear it in this particular podcast as well. That's because people in property recognize the importance of being connected with other people. Property is a people business, and that's the reason I've been running a networking event for over a decade now. Each and every month we bring like-minded people together, an opportunity for you to come along and meet some of those people and also learn from other people on the stage, learn from myself as well. So make sure you book onto the next meeting. We're on the third Tuesday of every month in Birmingham. Now let's get back to the podcast.
You carry on being a self-managed landlord and up your game and understand what's going on, because you're on the hook for loads and loads of
all the rules
compliance.
of regulations and everything. Yeah,
You're on the hook. There's rent repayments orders coming in at 24 months from 12 months if you don't comply with a lot of the new regulation and stuff coming in. If you don't want to self-manage, because it can be really difficult and every landlord is different.
Yeah.
Someone works full-time, there's that. If they don't have the time, they have to use a managing agent. Now, finding a managing agent in themselves is an art.
Yeah,
because there's a lot
managing the managing agent.
Managing the manager is true. There's some great managing agents out there. Look, I represent Property Redress. You know, they're in our group.
Yeah.
You know, and I'm on the board of the PRS, and I'm on the board of the group that owns PRS. You know, we've got 20,000 members. We did 15,000 complaints last year. The biggest complaints about agents is poor management service. I paid them a management service. They do nothing. They don't pass the rent on, which is rife.
Yeah.
Or holding deposits, you know, or misadvertise a property. That historically, a landlord uses a letting agent to find them a better tenant and to basically deal with everything.
To deal with that data headache, because it's a letting agency is the business of managing headaches. That's essentially you manage your problems all day.
You're Samaritans.
Yeah.
You know, I say this to my staff at Landlord Action. We really are the Samaritans. You know, we're like the emergency plumbers. You know, I did a talk last week for Property Mark Arler in King's Cross. I do talks and training, do loads and loads of training, as you know, on the circuit, Sarge. And I said, look, it's a people business. You have to show your landlords you care. You know, we go down Kings Heath High Street down here where you're recording studios. There's 15 agents. Who do I use?
Yeah.
Do I go to the one 5% full management? You know, cheap is always expensive because landlords don't like paying.
Not sustainable either.
It's not sustainable.
Yeah.
And you are going to have, and then we can talk about the regulation of property agents, ROPA, that's going to hopefully come in further down the line. And there should be some accreditation and regulation, but you need to show your landlords you care. And they're not just a number. How do you correspond and how do you communicate with regard to their property? Is their property being looked after? Am I getting the inspection reports? Do I have full transparency with regard to the referencing?
Yeah.
How is the affordability of that tenant? What do I know about that tenant? You know, have I got an account handler at my agency? You know, there's a million. When I go in, I train letting agents how to attract landlords to your business. I actually help them with pitching to landlords. And I find it a bit dumbfounding sometimes where there's still letting agents that still don't understand landlords and how they're feeling. You're a landlord, you set up a letting agent. A lot of the time,
I get what I wanted.
Because you can get rid of it. Normally it's because you've had a poor service, and that normally what happens. It's so common. So we deal with complaints, and I think letting agents are going to be needed more than ever in the Renters' Rights Bill. And I said to this crowd last week, I said, you have a duty of care to keep your landlords calm. You need to understand them. You need to stop them from selling. I asked them a question. How many of you have had Section 21 served because landlords are selling? 15, 20 hands went up.
Some of ours are sold, our landlords are sold.
It's inevitable. So the reality is because, you know, a letting agent is a compliance officer. They're a legal expert. They're a social worker. They're a mediator. You know, they've got to do a load of stuff. So do landlords that's doing self-manage. But a lot of landlords don't have those skill sets. So, you know, I think it's really important that landlords look in the mirror and think, do I want to carry on self-managing? You're also going to have a lot of landlords that have been landlords for a long time, that have managed themselves and didn't have a lot of legislation back in the day where, you know, if I talk about my deposits.
Yeah, when they started 30, 40 years ago, some of these
Nothing. There was nothing.
Yeah.
You just about had the 1988 Housing Act came in. That's it. I mean, you had, you know, some really good legislation that came in was relating to deposits because obviously it stopped loads of arguments in courts because landlords still forget that the deposit is the tenant's money, not the landlord's money.
And I just mentioned to you earlier, I had a message last week from somebody I know that says, oh, we've got a problem with the tenants. What's the issue? Oh, they're causing this. I said, what caused the problem? We didn't raise the deposit. I said, well,
and you've got
a problem now.
But the reality is we're going to be entering an even bigger new world, right? So, you know, you can claim 3 times plus the deposit. You get lots of companies that will act for tenants, and they're like claims companies. You'll see a lot more claims companies acting for tenants with regard to housing disrepairs, okay, with regard to rent repayment orders, and it'll be naive landlords that are tripping themselves up. That's why you've got to have the insurances in place. You know, we at Hamilton Fraser, we have, you know, total landlord insurance. You have like, you know, you're a member of Client Money Protect or professional indemnity insurance. You've got to make sure you're protected in that respect, but you've got to invest in your training and your learning. And this is the biggest change.
Yes, as you mentioned, a lot of this is about compliance and understanding. And many people got into the property sector back in the day where it was an investment, it was an easy thing to do, but it's evolved. It's constantly been changing. I've only been involved in property about 19 years, and the amount of change we've seen every year is huge. And this, I think, is one of the biggest changes that we'll see.
Yeah, it is the biggest. It is the biggest because look, let's talk about some of the other stuff. Look, it's not fatal. You need confidence.
It creates opportunities as well.
It creates opportunities.
We'll have a shake up in the market. People will disappear. When I got started in property, 2007, 8, that time, that was probably for many people the worst
after the crash.
But it helped me because many people were running off of the hill and think, yeah, there's lots of opportunities being left behind here.
Well, of course, there will be. There's landlords that have made good money and that are exiting, and they're also their properties cheap or whatever. Look at supply and demand. We have 68 million people live in this country. We have lots and lots of people coming to this country. They need to be housed. I think temporary accommodation, social housing, 3 and 5 year leases, I think it's going to be a way forward. It falls out on licenses that falls outside the Renters' Rights Bill. I think
just to emphasise that point, because not everybody will kind of understand what you mean.
Yeah,
I mean, there's no normal tenancies in that environment, meaning that actually the regulation doesn't apply. Because they are like, for example, you've gone to stay at a hotel for the night, you're on a license. Yeah, they can remove you the next day.
Exactly. It's like a temporary accommodation. I think the reality is you'll see differences and changes in markets. So, you know, what I'm seeing is if you get rid of, I work with temporary accommodation providers and so forth, the guaranteed rent to rent business, I've been heavily involved in that. I see it when it goes wrong. I've exposed 5 or 6 rogues and nightmare Tenant Slum Landlords. I've been locked in agents' offices, stealing rents, not passing it on. I think that market will shrink because, of course, if I'm taking a property from you on a company let, and then I'm giving a 1-month tenancy agreement to my tenant, and I'm doing an HMO, and someone doesn't pay, I can't rely on Section 21. It's not
a bad
there.
business model.
It's a bad business. So that model's going to shrink, without a doubt. And I've said that all along. I was actually going to set up a rent-to-rent association 10 years ago.
Oh, okay.
Believe it or not. And I think it's really important that the likes of the property redress scheme are actually there to actually, govern and look and see how things are done properly.
Rent operators, I say to them when I'm speaking to them, I said, what contracts do you use? And I said, management agreement. I said, okay, so you're set up as a letting agent now. I said, well, you're operating with management contracts.
I know.
So there's a lot of misunderstanding.
There is misunderstanding, but I think there's a lot. I think if I'm going to be a bit controversial here, I think a lot of the training providers out there have really caused that problem.
Yeah,
selling
they're
the dream.
Focused on selling the dream,
well,
not understanding the process in how to implement.
Look, people want to get into property, right? If you want to own property, unfortunately, you need money. However we like it or not, we need money. Yeah, you can JV.
One of the most expensive assets in anyone's life.
But, you JV and you can find, you could source and you can get part of equity and I get all that. But rent-to-rent's an easy entry. Yeah. But why would you give someone that's completely clueless? I've spoke at rent-to-rent courses and I've put people off. I tell it how it is. I've been in this game a long time. And I see it when it goes wrong. Running landlord action, we've done 40 to 50,000 instructions, right? We're one of the biggest players in the market.
Yes.
We are acting for rent-to-rent providers trying to get tenants out, but also landlords getting dodgy rent-to-rent providers out, and you're left with sublet. Don't forget, the innocent victims of all this are the tenants, the subtenants that are paying their rent willingly.
Yeah.
So I think that that will shrink. And rent-to-rent operators are definitely on the radar training standards. I've had conversations with them, so has Sean Hooker at the Property Redress, as you know. So it's about raising standards, just like, we raise standards with regard to property education and Cyril at the Property Education Bureau. We've got Property Redress involved we're all about protecting the consumer, whether it be tenant, landlord, sales agent, sourcing agents. We do that so that you have somewhere to complain to, because previous to that there was nothing.
Yeah, the sector operated for a long time with no
Wild West.
Yeah.
Wild West. But I think let's talk on the other stuff, SARS, with regard to the Renters' Rights Bill, which you talked about. Some of it makes total sense. Awab's Law. A poor little 6-year-old that died in 2022, Rochdale Housing Association, because he died from mould.
Yeah.
Disgraceful. Social housing provider, mind you.
I mean, personally, I think a lot of these challenges around, for example, damp and stuff, is way, way more prolific in the council and housing association properties than it is in the private sector.
It most probably it is. And of course, the thing is, you also have a lot of councils that have gone skint. So they can't afford to carry out repairs.
Yeah.
I saw a report, I think something like repairs went up 330%. You know, think about how distressing that is for a social tenant that's living in a property.
Yeah.
And they're living in terrible conditions. And like I said to you when we had a coffee before, I was on ITV News a couple of times talking about social housing and, you know, and doing interviews with Dan Hewitt on ITV News. So I think there's that. There's going to be a property landlord database.
Yes.
So you as a landlord will have to put your details. If you don't comply with that, the tenant finds out you haven't complied with that, they can ask for up to 2 years rent back in the rent repayment order. There's going to be landlord redress. So again, I'm your tenant, you're my landlord, you're self-managing. You don't carry out repairs or you're harassing me or whatever. You're not being... It's about making landlords more accountable, more professional, which is not such a bad thing, especially when tenants are paying 35, 40% of their wages towards rent and they're getting a substandard service. And that's why I think, and we talked about this, whereby tenants, you're talking about, you know, younger millennials, Gen Z or whatever, that are looking at these shiny blocks called build to rent, which are institutional investors that are building blocks, small space living, co-spacing, with a community. It's an American model that came in 25 years ago. We act for some big providers in our organisation. So you have on-site security, faster broadband, you have a gym. I told you I saw one with a recording studio, the barbers, you know, great living condition, but they maximise the rent.
Yeah.
And when landlords, I speak to landlords, like I spoke yesterday at the Landlord Investment Show at Aston Villa, and you say to landlords, do you know about what build to rent is in urban areas? And they look at me blankly and what's build to rent? They're the biggest competitors.
Yes. Yeah.
You know,
they're creating good quality accommodation, which your tenants has a choice of whether they come and stay with you or they're going to move into one of those.
Well, exactly. So if I could pay 200 quid more a month or 300 quid a month and I could get that or go and live above the shops, you know, and the problem you've also got, which is a big problem, is tenants are driven by the property, not by the landlord. So I think also, if I have to give any advice to tenants out there, and on average, there's 21 tenants looking for one property now. It was much higher beforehand. It's calmed down a bit.
Yeah.
But it ends up a beauty contest.
Yeah.
But of course, I say to landlords, it's still a good position to be in because you're getting better tenants than what you had before.
Yeah.
So how do you qualify tenants? Again, you have to look at risk. So do you get rent guarantee insurance? I work with a company called rentguarantor.com where you can ask your tenant to take out a policy, which is a guarantor, because I think landlords are going to ask for guarantors.
Yeah.
And if they don't pay, then the rent's paid every month and the legal fees. So, you know, bearing in mind the worry with regard to the court system, how slow it is, if they don't invest money in the court system, I think the new norm will be, by the time you get your property back, you could be looking at 1 year rent arrears. And I know that's quite shocking.
Yes.
But
find that with a small portfolio, maybe one or two properties, that's massive.
It cripples you.
Yeah.
And your mortgage costs gone up.
Yes.
And then we haven't even talked about one thing that's going to happen further down the line. EPCs, upgrades.
Yes.
Yeah. So if your property needs to go up to a level C, right? How do you get up to a level C? There's some really good eco grant companies out there that are actually really good, which I would recommend use. But obviously that depends on local authority funding.
Yes.
But you know, think about what landlords have had to go through in a recent time, and you know, not a lot of people are going to put the violins out for a lot of landlords. And I said yesterday in the audience, not every landlord drives a Bentley and a Ferrari and all that stuff. Not they're just normal people.
Yeah.
I mean, I was taking my dog for a walk about 2 years ago, and like you saw before, people recognise me from the show and stuff. And this guy, hello, Paul, love the show. He goes, I've got a tenant I need to find tenant tracing. So we offer fixed fees at Landlord Action.
Where the tenant's left.
And we do tracing and debt recovery also. And I said, how much do you owe? You start talking. And he's a postman. And he owns 8 properties. You know, landlords are everywhere.
So that money would have come from him saving over time, buying a property, maybe borrowing money and to really build that.
And I think that's what people miss. We're older. We're lucky. You know, I bought my first flat in northwest London for 40 grand at 23 in 1992.
I'm not quite that lucky.
Yeah, well, you look younger than me. Not as grey as me. But the reality is, we were lucky because we had small deposits. Yeah. The average deposit in London is, 130 grand?
Yeah.
Who can afford 130 grand for a deposit in London? So, you know, we have to give money to our kids to get on that ladder. So then as a younger person in the issue, you feel demoralised.
Yes.
Will I ever get on the ladder?
Yeah.
Is it a pipe dream? So then that becomes this anti-landlord resentment, while obviously you have tenant groups that are campaigning, you know, and I get really frustrated with it, really, because they don't help. I've sat with them at tables.
Yeah,
they need landlords. You know, there's anti-landlord. You need landlords. Don't scare landlords off, because all that's going to happen is you're going to make more of your tenants homeless.
Yeah. So what will happen with more and more landlords disappearing from this sector, and not all of those properties are going to get repurposed by other landlords, and that's fewer rental properties, which again is going to cause challenges.
Well, look, some of those might end up first-time buyers, but then there's look. I think the mortgage first-time market and mortgages have opened up. There's a lot. I think there's about 400 products out there for first-time buyers, which is pretty good. But I think the reality is, you know, don't demonise the landlord. I get fed up with it, and I've been protecting them, and I've been really, really trying to campaign to keep landlords, because, you know, most landlords are really
Well, they only exist because the government doesn't provide all the accommodation. If the government provided all the accommodation, there'd be no room for any.
So that's a seamless link, because I was going to turn around and say the manifesto of Angela Rayner, bless her, she turned around and said 1.5 million properties, which is now it's 1.3. I could turn around and say there's more chance of my football team Tottenham winning the league than that happening, right? You need 25,000 bricklayers. You need 15,000 carpenters. We can't get a skilled workforce.
It's headline grabbing.
Of course
but
it is.
They haven't been able to do this for decades.
No, for decades. It's decades and decades. Conservatives, 14 years. They all fail. Every single government. What
colour was at number 10.
100%.
They haven't been able to deliver it.
We're going to provide 300,000 properties. It's all rubbish. Look, I think we've actually got a really good shadow housing minister in, Kevin Hollyoake, who's a really good guy, and he set up and ran Hunters. He gets it. But when you have 16 housing ministers in 13 years, you've got two Opes, Bob Hope and no Hope. I mean, there's no continuity.
Yes.
So, you know, there needs to be cross-party continuity when it comes to housing, having housing experts that don't have any political now or, you know, just with regard to what's the objective.
Yes.
And it gets frustrating. I mean, I remember Grant Shapps, who I used to know from many, many moons ago, and I reached out to him and I talked to him, and I campaigned to my MPs. I drive them mad. You know, my MP was brilliant, and she was on my YouTube channel, Theresa Villiers. She was a Northern Ireland secretary, and I said to her, and I had 3 meetings with her, and she lost her seat to Labour in the end, where I am in North London. And I said, Theresa, I'm really worried about the rental stock crisis. Landlords are going to leave in their drive. I still called this 5-6 years ago. I really did. You can, and you know, the start of it, as we know, was Section 24, Sarge, in 2017.
The taxation,
yeah, and you know, where landlords get taxed on turnover, not profit,
which just seems like an insane idea. But it's like
you can't offset your mortgage payment against as a disbursement. It doesn't make sense, but of course it does for the government, because they make loads of money out of it. And then of course you had mortgage interest rises, where obviously Liz Truss came in. But I do have to remind landlords, you had 0% interest rates for the best part of 10 years. We had it fantastic,
which is an artificial bubble, which wasn't reality.
Exactly. But you milked that cow.
Yeah.
You did fantastic. Now interest rates are at a norm.
Yes, which is what they were historically at those sort of rates.
Of course. I remember, because I'm old enough and ugly enough, I could say you're ugly enough, but you're old enough. You'll remember the days where the interest rates were 15%.
Yeah.
You know, 88, 90. So in my former life, I worked in a firm of solicitors, and I did my first court hearing at 16 in the recession in 1987, Brighton County Court, District Judge Lay. I remember he threw me out the court because my tie was undone. It was pulled to the side. That's why I never wear ties. I have a phobia of ties now, believe it or not. You'll never see me wear a tie at an event. But that's how I started doing advocacy. But the interest rates then, and people won't realise unless they're old enough like us, the interest rate was 14, 15%.
Norman Lamont?
Yeah. So it was 14, 15%, and unemployment was 3.5 million. And I was in and out. I did 14 hearings in one day once at 17 years old.
Wow.
So I used to do all the hearings as an agency working in my law firm. So my first job working in a law firm was £4,200 a year. I was an outdoor clerk in a law firm in Brighton. Wow. And then I moved to London in 1990. But I'd always done law. And that was just by chance. I wasn't academic or anything, but I did the practicality. I did court hearings. I remember once I did a court hearing I did a bail application at the Old Bailey at 18, 19 years old. So I used to work for a law firm that was a criminal law firm as well,
Right.
as a civil and a litigation. And there was a bail application. The guy was a juvenile, was 17 years old, and the barrister went off, and I was in the cells talking to. He'd done like a stick up on it was like an armed robbery with a fake gun
Right.
on a tube. He
Okay.
was robbing people. And I got a call from the judge's clerk saying you need to do a bail application. And I didn't know what I was doing. I knew I was going to get it because they asked me to do it. And he said to me, he goes, "You're one of the youngest people I've come for an Old Bailey judge." I was just a clerk,
Yeah.
you know. So I think that's where I kind of like maybe got my confidence to be able to.
What was the journey from there then? That's
Yeah.
kind of got you
Yeah.
getting involved in kind of law firms is where you started.
So I believe it or not, Sarge, I left school, no qualifications.
Okay.
I remember I was always quite good at sales, and I was a real grafter. I didn't come from money. My dad reminds me of this story because he used to have a hairdresser's shop in Fulham, and he had a boutique as well. And he closed it down. We moved to a place called East Grinstead before moving to Brighton, and he had these sweatshirts. At 13 years old, he goes, "Go and sell them," and we go halves.
Right.
I was 13 years old. I was tiny then. You can imagine I haven't really grown since then. I had a big black bag. I was door-to-door knocking.
Wow.
I was selling them for £1, and I sold like 25 T-shirts, right, or whatever it was.
Yeah.
So I was always quite good at sales.
There's not a lot to be said for that skill of being able to knock.
Yeah,
on the door.
I was always quite good. I had that confidence. But then, of course, doing the advocacy, the public speaking, and then falling into PR. So then I worked in law firms. I became a bailiff, a debt collector, private investigator, did a whole lot of mad stuff. Went to some of the worst council estates in London, trying to collect money. Been chased by armed guards in Egypt, trying to serve a high court writ on a CEO of a Cairo bank for 9 minutes. Done some mad stuff, but I'd always done evictions. And then I met my old business partner, Jonathan, and I helped him evict 23 illegal immigrants in a 3-bed flat in North London. And we worked in the same office building. We used to play football with each other. And out of that was born Landlord Action. I did it for fixed fees. No one was doing it.
This was where you...
That was 2000.
So just to be clear on Landlord Action, for those that are not familiar with it, you're dealing with the eviction process for the landlord, the kind of whole thing.
Yeah, so we would like disruptors. Me and Johnny were disruptors. And we were really fed up with lawyers charging too much money. So he was a landlord, a portfolio landlord in Luton, and he was using solicitors who were charging too much money. And I said, no, I can do it. And we worked, and I do it for this, and this. And I worked, and we were an unregulated firm of eviction agents. And we set up in 2000. And as I said to you, 3-4 months later, we had a half-a-page editorial in the Evening Standard. It was mental. We had like 10,000-12,000 calls from it, just me and him in an office in Kentish Town. And that's how I understood PR. And then, by the end of that year, or beginning of 2021, I was doing TV, I was doing radio, and I was doing speaking events.
2001?
2001, yeah.
Not 21.
2001. Jesus, I was losing the plot. Yeah, 2001. So 24 years I've been doing public speaking, TV and radio and stuff like that. And I only did it thinking, I'm going to get more work for my business. That was all I thought about. And I remember, I mean, you know what it's like. We've been doing the circuit. I'd be going to some of the shittiest talks ever. I remember going to the Wrexham Council. I'd done a day's graft. Then I left North London, like maybe, like midday. It was an evening talk, went to Wrexham, turned up, and there was 3 people there.
Wow.
At a landlord talk. Went all the way back,
Yeah.
and I'm in the office at 8 o'clock in the morning.
Wow.
When you have your own business, I say this to people don't understand
Don't
this.
switch off.
I mean, I have a very addictive personality, and we talked about, do I have ADHD? Most probably do. I haven't been diagnosed, but I'm obsessive. I'm addictive, and and it's just when you run your own business, you become obsessed.
Yes.
Sometimes to your detriment, believe me, because you can't see the wood from the trees. Yeah. But I've had this fire in my belly to succeed, because but now I'm kind of like, it's a bit different now. So obviously Landlord Action, so we started running the business, and in basically 2014, I didn't like the way the industry of the eviction, because I started the whole industry, me and my partner, and we had all these other companies, all these copycat companies, cutting corners, doing dodgy things or whatever. So we turned that, and so the business that we were disrupting, solicitors saying you were greedy, we became a firm of solicitors. So it took us 14 months to become a firm of solicitors regulated by the Solicitors Regulation Authority,
right,
called an ABS.
Yeah.
And that was in 2014. We brought a solicitor in, And then in 2017, I was still doing the TV programs. So I started doing Nightmare Tenants in 2015. I'd done 64 episodes up and down the country.
Wow,
and that was while running a business.
Yeah.
So they'd say, well, and all the stories were our stories, sides, mental stories. So I always made it my mission to expose serial bad tenants that go from one property to another, rogues, really bad rogues.
Because there's no database of those.
There's no database. I said that to the government once and they laughed at me. There's rogue landlord and rogue agent, but over tenant. That's another story. But that would just create more homelessness. And then the worst serial bad tenant we had at Landlord Action was 148 grand, cost 5 landlords in 6 years.
Wow.
And I gave a dossier to the police and they did nothing about it because it's civil. Civil. And while I was doing that, I was doing campaign to bring the squatters law that came in. I went to Downing Street in 2012 to make that a criminal act as well. But the stories, so I did loads of stories. Then I did a radio show on LBC with, at that time I was working with Direct Line before I sold Landlord Action.
Yeah.
And I think out of all the media stuff that I've done, that was the biggest buzz.
Right.
I was doing live radio and I was with a legendary broadcaster called Clive Ball, who I still speak to today. Yeah. And I go on every month with Ian Collins and Talk TV. I do a property segment where I do Q&As with landlords and first-time buyers and all that type of stuff. But yeah, but now, I mean, our business, Landlord Action, we built a really strong brand up. And then in 2017, we sold that to my really good friend Eddie Hooker at Hamilton Fraser, who owned My Deposit, Property Redressing, Client Money Protect, Total Landlord Insurance.
Hence, all sit under that umbrella.
And then sourced that under that umbrella. And then I went on the board of the business.
Yeah.
And then 2-3 years ago, I'm still, I still enjoy it to this day, but running Landlord Action, setting up 25 years ago, it's mental.
Yeah.
It's.
But you've gone through the whole business where you've been the one knocking on doors.
Yeah, yeah.
To sitting on the board now, so you understand the business.
And then I've had to. I've really had to adapt to the corporate world. I mean, to a private company, and yeah, your mindset changes. So I help people. I do loads of public speaking and do a bit of consultancy and all that. But yeah, my main job is at Hamilton Fraser. I still really enjoy it, and I work with some great people. And Eddie and Sean, they're my really good friends.
So for someone watching right now who's a landlord who's thinking about all this change is coming, what's the 2-3 things that you think they really should be focusing on right now? What should they be thinking about in preparation?
So firstly, just keep calm.
Yeah.
Don't. I've seen this, I've seen that, speak to my mate about. Just keep calm. Yeah, keep calm. Watch YouTube like this. Go to the Landlord Investment Show. Be a member of the NL. Just get the information. And it's all at the end of your fingertip. When I started, the internet hadn't. Google had just about started. Literally, I think it started in 99. I started in 2000 or whatever. You've got everything at your end of your fingertips. Just keep calm. Look at the detail. Property is still a really good investment. People need to live somewhere. They need to sleep somewhere. Yeah. Rents are at a very good level.
Yes.
Right. They're only going to keep going up. Government aren't going to build. Right. It's going to take ages and ages and ages. They need the private rental sector, but don't bash the landlords. So look at the detail. Business view, have an exit strategy. Right. So I've been doing this for 15, 20 years. I've been doing this for 3 years. That journey is different to that journey.
Yeah.
Yeah. Look at it. Get a power team. Get people, do the training. Get good, reasonable training. Get the right people in the right places. Make sure I understand tax.
Yeah.
Right? There's a couple of organisations out there that are getting done for tax and landlords. Making sure you understand the fundamentals. But don't panic about the legislation. If you don't like it, then just sell. Get out.
Yes.
Don't moan about it.
Yeah.
It's hard, but it will be okay. It'll be okay. I was involved with I didn't mention that, the Deregulation Act 2015. I went to Parliament. I gave evidence. I was next to Shelter. I was next to Property Mark, David Coxton. I gave evidence relating to retaliation eviction between cross-party.
Yes.
And everyone thought the Deregulation Act came in, the Tenant Fees Act, they thought that agents would fall by the wayside. Yeah. So things that, you got rent to right. There's all this stuff that changes.
You have to evolve.
You have to evolve. I just wish that the government would stop the political points and value the good job that landlords do, really. But landlords have to up your game.
Yes.
If you don't want to up your game, you still want to stay in, make sure you find a really good managing agent because they are the heart and soul of you running a very important investment.
So you've got people that are self-managing we talked about, and then those that are relying on agents. As you said, what the key things maybe they should look for in a letting agent when trying to determine who they should give their property to?
Right. Yeah. So what's their reputation locally? Yeah, you can go on you know, you can go and Google reviews or Trustpilot or allagents.co.uk. Find out what's their reputation. Speak to other landlords that have used their service. Absolutely important. What's their terms of business? What's the difference between let only and full management? Historically, letting agents undercharge what they do. And I say this when I train. I go into agents and I help them pitch to landlords because they don't understand who's in their databases and what the landlord's journey is all about. They're going to save landlords time. They're going to find them a better tenant. They're going to look after their property. They have to convince the landlord that when I have a gut feeling. So I came to your agency and I spoke to one of your staff. I have to have a good feeling about that.
Yeah.
I have to show you care. You know, you own your own property. Are you a buy-to-let expert in that area? You know, do you know it? Because the three most common questions an agent will tell you to win instruction, you know, or landlord will ask you, sorry, how much will you get? When can you rent it? And what are you going to charge me?
Yeah.
You know, and the problem is
it's just the numbers.
It's just the numbers,
Yeah.
but there's more than that.
Yes.
You know, and you know, historically, there's some great agents out there do amazing jobs, and they are needed. But the problem is, I think the agency industry and the landlord industry, and it could be all of one, we have to change the perception of how the general media and the general public see us. Because in the bottom 10 professions, landlords are in there and estate agents are in there, down with traffic wardens, bailiffs, bankers, politicians. I can go on.
Yeah.
We have to change that.
Yeah.
And we need to, you do that by becoming more professional. And I think that's really important.
Yeah. It's definitely been evolving. It's moved. The standards have been forced up, which is only a good thing.
Most definitely.
That's happening. And from the other perspective, let's say someone's a tenant. What do you think they should be thinking about and mindful of what's going on right now or what may happen in a year's time?
So, yeah, I think that's a really good question. I think there's clearly tenant stress. You know, I speak to lots of tenants. I make sure I'm really on the ground on everything with regard to my industry. So I can do interviews like this and understand it and have stats and all that type of stuff. Being tough for a tenant. So firstly, you need to put your best foot forward when you're meeting a landlord. If you like that property,
yes,
you need to showcase yourself. I know it doesn't sound right. It's not. It should be a CV or it should be a job interview. But why should he pick me and not him? Right? There's open house viewings. Understand the agent. Show that you're a good bet. Show that you do have good credit rating. Show you do care about the property. Show actually, if you are moving and you've had to move because your landlord's selling, which is really common, show him the new landlord, get the good landlord reference, show him how you kept that property.
Yeah.
You know, I'm looking after my property. Show you understand. I think it's good that tenants do have more rights. I think it's important. But I think affordability is a big issue. But I think the top tips I would give a tenant is, you know, you are driven by the property. There's going to be the stop of anti-bidding laws. That's going to stop under the Renters' Rights Bill. So what that means is it's not an auction.
Yeah.
And that's a good thing. But all that's going to happen is landlords will just put the rent up.
Start at a higher price.
They start at a higher price. So I think that's the reality. I think that you can, if you're a tenant, you can ask for a pet in the new world. Yeah. Which I think is reasonable, depending what the pet is. A landlord can decline it if there's a head lease or whatever. I think there can't be discrimination against tenants. You know, no DSS, no children. You know, in this day and age, you should never have it.
Yeah, but it still happens. And people still find ways around it.
Well, what will happen is if I put an advert out, you know, an open rent, you know, they're a client of ours, they're a really big, you know, online agency or whoever it may be, and I come forward and there's 15, 20, there's lots of people. And, you know, it is a landlord's market. Yeah. Let's be clear about it. It's a landlord's market.
There's not enough rental stock,
Right, because there's not enough rental stock. I'm going to go to make sure with all these rules and regulation coming and knowing, can I get my property back? I can't use Section 21. The grounds are there. The courts are taking ages. I'm going to take rent guarantee. I've got to think about all this. I've got to think about all this risk-averse stuff. Who have I got? I want to see from your agent. I want to see the free references. Yeah. I get cheesed off when agents said I can't give it to you under data protection.
Yeah, I've had those arguments in the past, which is one of the reasons we set up our own agency. So you're not going to tell me who you're going to put in the property. Why should I?
It's your choice. You're the landlord. The landlord makes the choice. The landlord employs the agent. The agent can give the recommendations. So if I've got that,
the title agent is representative.
1,000,000%, Sarge. So what I'm saying is, if I've got all these people and I got the top, I go to the free, I take my time, I'm not going to be rushed. When you get rushed, it's when what it is that when you get the dodgy tenants, they can go on portals and they can sniff out a clueless landlord. Yeah. I'll give you 6
Let's
months of
say
rent.
now what
You
questions
can't
you-
ask, one thing we haven't mentioned, you can only ask for 1 month rent in advance. That's a massive game changer.
Yeah.
Overseas, students, more vulnerable tenants.
we do it all the time. We'll take 3 months, 6 months rent in advance.
That's going to stop.
Where we want to protect a certain position where the tenant's happy to do that and you feel that's the right thing to do. And if that stops, that means actually we don't feel comfortable now letting into a certain category.
Well, that's the point I'm making. So what I'm saying is the biggest losers in all this, I'm sorry to be cynical, are going to be the more vulnerable tenants, the people on benefits.
Yeah.
Local housing allowance freed up last year, which was a good thing. You have universal credit. You need to get direct payment. Sometimes that stops. Circumstances, you can only get direct payments for vulnerability and stuff like that. So if I've got universal credit and my rents have been going up, and then I get a couple from the hospital that, you know, he's a private consultant or a doctor, or I've got a professional, whatever, and there's a top up of £300, £200 a month, who am I going to go with?
Yeah.
That's economics. You
Yeah.
don't have to say no DSS tenants,
Yeah.
but the reality is unintended consequences.
Yeah, you're protecting your business because you think the chances of that tenant not paying, messing me about, being more concerned about their credit file is much higher. So it makes me safer.
Exactly. But the reality is we need social housing. We're desperate for social housing. You know, we have people in hotels. It's costing an absolute fortune. We need to address a growing population. It's a massive, massive problem.
Yeah.
Okay. But I think there'll be more landlords in the private rental sector that will look at that. But then there's loads of great landlords that are housing benefit tenants, and statistically a housing benefit tenant will look after the property you look at
Be there longer.
and stay there.
Yeah.
You want the tenant to treat that property as a home. One thing that we haven't touched on, which I am seeing a big change, and I am seeing it because I act for a lot of institutional funds, right? We've got one client that's got 6,500 units that we act for. We do their evictions, deposits, stuff like that. They're buying loads of blocks. So what I'm saying is they're piling in. The government do prefer bigger corporate landlords, institutional investments, but there's still room for smaller landlords. They do give a vital service.
Paul, we could talk about this for hours. And
I know.
hours. What's the best way for somebody to connect with you and reach out to you?
So I have just launched my own YouTube channel. Right,
it's taken ages, but
it's taken age. I should have done. It's all different parts. You know what? It just one funny story.
It's happened now.
It's happened. I should have done it in COVID, but all different butts because I went mental in COVID. But you can imagine, obviously, from speaking with 20 minutes.
Yes.
So I was driving myself mad. So I've got a YouTube channel, Paul Shamplina Talking, TALKIN Property.
Yeah.
I launched it about 3-4 months ago. It's straight talking. It's there to give a bit of advice to landlords, tenants, first-time buyers, and agents. I do a really good section on there called Lifetime Stories and Property, where I get someone who's been at the top of their game in any other field other than property, and I quite enjoyed interviewing. I've had a top DJ, I've had a football agent, I've had an MP, so I do all that stuff. But yeah, so I do that, and I've been busy as well, as you know. I've been running a charity boxing event for 10 years called Rumble with the Agents. That's on the 19th of June. We sold that out. This year we're raising money for Centrepoint. We're doing one on the 4th of December in Newcastle if anyone wants to come. Yeah. So they can reach out to me there. And lastly, I've got I'm doing a training event called Landlord Survival Guide on the 4th of June in Euston with Tracy and Steve Hanbury from the Landlord Investment Show.
Yes. So we'll get the links for those. We'll put them in the description as well. We'll put the YouTube channel link as well, which people should definitely go to. I think that's one of the things that people really love about you. You're very straightforward, very straight talking, no nonsense kind of guy. And
no BS.
I think that's it. And look, I'm really pleased you're taking time out today. I think it opens up for a part 2 in the coming months.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.